podcast is called The Idea. We always break down, an idea or a set of ideas. Alina is with me from, she is a Harvard alum, and she is a current employee of ConservAmerica, which is a conservative conservation organization. That's a lot of alliteration going on at the same time. And so we're probably going to jump in there, and then we'll talk what we're laughing about maybe towards the tail end here. So first of all, let's start there. You and I met on Twitter, as I meet many interesting people. So are most people surprised to find out this exists, first of all, like a conservative kind of green thing?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I guess just to clarify, I'm a fellow with ConservAmerica. I don't work for them full time or anything. So I want to make sure that all the comms people are happy.
Gotcha.
But mostly do writing with them, things like that. Yeah, I think I get surprised from both sides of the aisle, both from other environmentalists who are like, "Oh, you're conservative? Why are you here?" And then from conservatives going, "I thought that was a dirty word," which I like. I like kind of switching up the narrative a little bit. I think it's a necessary thing, but I also think it's kind of a modern trend that these two things feel like they're at odds. Certainly, I don't think that my grandpa would have found this weird at all. He was a huge outdoorsman, constantly was dragging us through the woods and having us carry canoes through camping trails and whatever. And so I don't know. Yeah, a lot of people are surprised, but I think it's a good kind of thing.
Well, here's what I've observed. As somebody, if I take the political compass test, I'm fairly centrist. Probably a lot of people who, and I think on allsides.com, I'm ranked as center right, which is probably pretty fair there. And
Yeah.
what I see is a lot of people who have like all the environmental stickers on their Prius or whatever, like they don't actually go do anything, like as far as like being outside. And I'm like, so you care about the environment from Starbucks and from your couch watching TV and from wherever you get your hair dyed blue at, I guess. Like, I'm like,
Yeah.
so you like this. And I feel like it's sort of like a relationship. Like if you claim you're in a relationship with somebody, but you never see them, like, are you?
Yeah,
Is
I
that
would agree
fair?
with that. I think that's fair. One of the things that we do, especially with like grassroots environmentalism, is literally just get people outside, which seems kind of crazy. A lot of people are like, okay, what are your federal priorities? What are your state level priorities? And I'm like, listen, we're going hiking this weekend. You can come if you want. You don't have to have any sort of political affiliation or anything like that. But I think kind of getting people outdoors, especially locally in their communities, you don't have to turn these into like twice a year giant trips to the Himalayas, although that's awesome if you can
Yeah.
afford that, especially. But I think just getting outdoors and yeah, having that sort of relationship with the environment is huge because you kind of start to see the impacts over time. My dad was always a huge person as far as, okay, you guys have been watching TV too long. We're all going on a giant hike. He did that to us Christmas morning this year. Um, and I think it's really important to kind of keep fostering that.
Yeah. And, I'll criticize myself for criticizing something here. There's something around St. Louis. It's like, St. Louis inclusive hikes or, some whatever liberal buzzword. And it's like 420 friendly. And I'm like, you're serious? You're going to go walk a half a mile and smoke weed. Like that's the plan. And then I realized, you know what? That's still a starting point for somebody. Like, I think it's absurd and kind of rude as well to be smoking out there. But you know what? For somebody that's not going to, sorry, my camera went out of focus for some reason.
Okay.
For somebody who's like not normally into that, I'm just happy that they're doing something. Like that's still a pretty good starting point.
I think as a starting point, I think that we need to be a little bit more comfortable just being outside doing normal things. I have loved when I see people working from home who are calling in and you see them in their backyard. I think that's freaking awesome. I think we've kind of become homebodies or like almost afraid of, well, what if the wind blows? And it's like, what if it does? It's okay. Um, but I don't know. I'm certainly not really a fan of the weed thing in general. I have kind of noticed that trend. I think, especially amongst crunchy people, and especially once you get into like the libertarian crowd, kind of left leaning libertarians, especially, you end up with a lot of people who are really, really 420 friendly. I've certainly run into quote unquote hiking buddies, and they're like, "Well, what do you smoke?" I'm like, "Oh, I don't mean that kind of hiking. I mean, we're going to be doing like 10 miles and you probably should not be smoking if you want to treat this
You're
like
actually going to
exercise."
need your lungs for this.
you are going to need your lungs and you can't have them sidetracked. But yeah, I mean, I would say that as opposed to smoking indoors while you're playing video games and eating takeout, as much as I love eating takeout, um, yeah, I guess it's a net improvement. At the same time, I've seen those sorts of things. I'm moving soon, so I've been all over Eventbrite and Meetup and trying to figure out, okay, what kind of groups can I plug into? Um, and I have seen a lot of them where I'm like, okay, if this is like a specifically for a 20 friendly event, I'm just not going to have fun. And certainly for my job and things like that, I don't want to be around people who are smoking. So I think sometimes you end up being more exclusive by trying to be quote unquote inclusive, especially with things like marijuana.
Yeah. There is, and I'm actually gonna go way, way back here when I try to explain, I guess, why some people are more afraid of the woods than others. Have you ever
Yeah.
heard the whole thing about how the British didn't move off the East Coast for the most part? Or no, is this new?
No.
Like when so in England, there were so many robberies because England actually does have tons of green space, like tons of like
Yeah.
thick, dense forests. And the people who were from England proper were afraid to move because they didn't know anything about the woods because that's where like robbers murdered you. Okay. Scots,
That's crazy.
Irish, German people were primarily the ones that, and I guess there were some like French trappers who were very un-French and that they were, courageous. And well, that joke didn't land. Maybe it did for the audience.
I think you
But
did for the audience. I'm slow. Sorry.
if you look at the groups that were that were pushing west, it was the ones who weren't afraid of the woods, right?
Yeah.
And so I think about that in a modern context and being like, well, instead of like kind of being a jerk about like, oh, well, why are you such like an indoorsy wuss? Maybe a better way to think about it is, okay, so a good portion of the population has never had any occasion to really be introduced to the outdoors unless
Yeah.
maybe somehow they got it from YouTube. And that's cool if you found that yourself. But I think about like kind of, hiking, kayaking, all like kind of outdoor, we'll call it like national park style exploration, right? Hunting has come back in a huge way for
Totally.
millennials and Gen Z. And I don't know that the other kind of outdoor pursuits really have had the same resurgence. Do you have any ideas on why or how we can make that happen more?
I think it's been interesting. During college, I did rock climbing and I would do like rock climbing competitions and stuff. And there was a really huge resurgence kind of around just like the crunchy folks in the rock climbing community. But it was interesting that a lot of the people that I would meet at these competitions, a lot of them did like pretty exclusively indoor climbing. Our group kind of did a mix of both. We'd go out into the woods and we'd do like actual top rope climbing and things like that. But I think there's sort of this like orange theoryization, if you will, this trend of kind of being able to package something into a little class pass model and make it super, super repeatable and scalable. I think you see this with a lot of the way that we engage with exercise, where, okay, it has to fit into exactly 2 hours of my week. I only have time to do this hobby right before I go to Whole Foods. And then right after that, I go get my hydrofacial or whatever it is. And I think we're not used to just taking time and letting an activity consume our day. We want it to kind of fit into our Google Calendar. I think a lot of it is that folks are busy. People kind of want to know exactly what to expect from something. And unfortunately, the outdoors, like sort of properly undertaken when you're not going rock climbing inside, which is also cool, but it's not outdoors, obviously. You really don't get to plan like that. I plan really long hikes with a friend of mine for folks in DC a lot. And it's funny because they'll be like, okay, what time are we getting back to DC? And we're like, we're going probably a minimum of 10 miles. I have no idea. Sometime tonight, pretty late. Don't make plans afterwards if you want to come, or just come another time. Um, and I think that like our impulse to plan and have sort of really authoritative control over our time and our lives is pretty incompatible with being outdoors. That said, I think sometimes we also consider it a little bit high of a bar for what counts as being outdoors. Um, my dad always made sure that we were near some park or ponds, things like that. We would just kind of go. They actually call it a lake in our town, but it's really, really small. So it's a glorified pond. We would just walk around the pond every day. and there's geese and there's fish and you can do fishing there. I lifeguarded there at one point. Um, and it's a pretty low bar. I mean, it was, next to our house.
Yeah.
But you don't have to be doing the Rocky Mountains every weekend to call yourself an outdoorsman. Like it doesn't have to be a huge personality trait like that.
And where'd you actually grow up at?
I grew up in upstate New York, which when I tell people I'm from New York, they kind of assume that I'm from the city. I'm from kind of outside of Buffalo. Go Bills. But yeah, I grew up pretty rural area. And then where my dad's family lives right now is much more suburban. It's right by the Bills Stadium, actually.
Okay.
So
Yeah. Yeah, no, my wife lived out there briefly in like elementary school for a few years, and it's
awesome.
much more rural than, I mean, it's kind of like how people see the rest of the country.
Yep.
Like they, this is the day after the college women's national championship game, which I appreciate because it introduced a lot of Americans to the fact that there's a state called Iowa. They found out there's a state called Iowa because it was on ESPN.
I
I'm
still
like, yeah,
don't really believe it, but I'll take your word for it.
Iowa's the best state. Like I grew up on the Illinois-Iowa border, and I tried to move to Des Moines. It didn't work out. I weird flex, but Iowa's the best state.
Interesting. That's a take, and I think everyone needs takes. And
Yeah,
you have some.
yeah, and how politicians always say, like, we're in the great state of whatever.
Insert
We're in the
something
great
here,
state of
yeah.
Arizona. Yeah, yeah. That's the whole thing. Like, as we get into a situation where we could actually be in a very large global conflict, that's what I've always said about like nuclear war, is if you
They're not
hit
hitting
us,
Iowa.
obviously it's a full scale invasion, unless you hit like LA or New Jersey or maybe like Cleveland, then it's like a strongly worded email. It's like, well, we would appreciate it if you don't do that. Don't do that again.
Please don't.
And if you're going to do it again, don't do it again. But if you're going to do it again, if you wanted to hit like Dayton this time, then absolutely no more after that. That's really, we can't have this anymore.
Well, I'm moving to Columbus soon, so Dayton might be close for comfort, but I'll throw
Really?
Cleveland under the bus. That sounds
okay.
good.
So what? When you said you were moving, like I didn't realize you were moving that much. And
oh yeah.
Yeah. So why the move across the country, and how do you find like outdoor friends out there?
So TBD. So if anyone is in Columbus and wants to go hiking, let me know. So I am moving because I made the mistake of falling head over heels for both a libertarian and someone from Ohio, which are both things that I vowed I would never do.
But I'm guessing like the non-weed smoking kind from the conversation so far.
Weed smoking kind, certainly the non-weed smoking kind. Yeah, man plans, God laughs kind of thing. So I'm moving to Columbus. Both of us kind of work remote, or he's international a lot, so it kind of doesn't really matter where we end up. And he's got family in Columbus, and I personally think it's important, at least long term, to be close to one of our families. And New York State taxes don't really make sense as a remote worker, so
yeah,
should be good.
No, actually, Columbus is a really cool town. Cincinnati's a really cool town.
He's from Cincinnati, so I won't
yeah.
tell him you said that, but he's a little
listen to a podcast you're on.
Oh, he probably will, unfortunately.
I was gonna say, should you be moving for him if he's not gonna listen to a podcast you're on? Like,
yeah, true. I listen to the ones he's on, so
yeah,
yeah,
that seems like the bare minimum type of thing there. No, Ohio. Ohio's a really good mountain biking scene, by the way. So if you're listening in Ohio, or you're moving there or whatever, there's a really cool spot. There's some really, really cool spots there. So if that's something you want to get into, I'd highly recommend it. It's one of those things where I think there's a lot more women that do it now, which is pretty cool.
I had a grad school classmate who was super, super into mountain biking, and she's just like the cutest girl ever. Like, I really wouldn't have guessed that about her. She's like super prim and proper and professional, and is just a wicked mountain biker. But yeah, as far as finding friends on it, and I don't even think this just applies to outdoors activities, but I've kind of noticed that events are fake and you can just make them up. And if you put a Google form out there and say, hey, we're doing this on this day and we need drivers, people just put in their information and you make friends. And it's hard not to make friends with at least a couple people when you're stuck on a trail together.
Yeah.
But I think as long as you're willing to be the planner, whether that's for organizing cleanups, if you're doing sort of the environmental cleanup thing, or you want to organize hikes, or heck, I even say just organize brunches. Like, if you can find 3 or 4 women who will give you their phone number and they want to go to brunch and they don't have anyone to go to brunch with, and then you create a group chat afterwards. You just made a friend group. Like that's I'm sorry, that's literally just how friends are made. And I don't know. I certainly have had it a lot easier in DC. I think DC has just got this culture of like networking and making new friends. I don't think a lot of places are quite as hospitable for that sort of thing, but I also don't think that it's rocket science. And I don't know. I plan to just kind of annoy people until they stick around. So we'll see how that goes.
I'm really highly extroverted, so I've usually had a pretty easy time wherever I go finding something to get into or, whatever. And there's kind of those memes of like, how do you make friends as an adult? And it's like activities. Just
Yeah.
pick anything. Like,
Have hobbies.
yeah, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, like knitting. Like there are people
Just
still
do
do leave
hobbies.
their
Yeah.
yeah, people still do leave their houses. So just go find a thing and ask people what they're into. So that's super cool. You're going over there. On the conservative kind of conservative conservation, if you will. So what
Yeah.
is that? I'm not actually super familiar with kind of you said the first thing is to get people outside, which I'm super pumped about. And then what does that look like as far as policy? How does this differ from like kind of left-wing conservation, that type of thing?
Yeah, so I think the best way that I always hear this explained is you've got 3 things. You've got conservation, recreation, and preservation. Recreation being, okay, let's have as much fun as possible and let's carve a roller coaster into the side of all of our natural resources and like the beauty of the Rocky Mountains or whatever. That's maximizing for recreation, and then it's not going to be around very long. I live near the cherry blossoms in DC, and people were like breaking off pieces, and it was breaking my heart. Like, what the heck are you doing? Um, but recreation is, totally maxing out for people enjoying stuff. Preservation is, okay, let's just keep it under a microscope and nobody touch nature, and we're going to leave it there so that it stays beautiful forever. And conservation is kind of the marriage of the two, right? It's like, okay, we need this because, the reason that we're preserving nature is for humans, not against humans. But we also need to make sure that we're maximizing that, and not just from like, a natural resources, how much can we extract from this in the long term, but because nature matters just as a natural good. And I think kind of the way that progressives have been talking about this, or certainly the trend has been more preservation than conservation. It's let's keep the earth safe from humans rather than let's keep the earth safe for humans. And I think the reason that the one group that I work with is called American Conservation Coalition, and certainly with ConservAmerica, I think there's much more of that focus with conservatives on, okay, what is the end point of all this? And ultimately, it's humans. I mean, human life matters, and human flourishing matters. And if we want nature to be pointed towards those ends, then we need to be conserving it, not just preserving it. And we also don't need to just be destroying it for human short-term gratification, which I think is something that I would hope all environmentalists agree on. I think policy-wise, though, and I've seen a lot of this push, certainly with ACC, a lot of push towards more clean but also reliable energy. Renewable energy is awesome, and I think that we need what we call an all-of-the-above energy approach. But we also need energy that we can rely on. And unfortunately, with renewables, so like solar, wind, it's just not going to cut it, certainly for that firm power. So what we think of as like what's powering us 24/7, 365, solar and wind are awesome. And they're kind of icing on the cake in a lot of ways. And, we can close a lot of the gap with them, but they're not going to be like actually supporting the entire country. So things like nuclear power, which when I call it clean energy, I think people are always really surprised. They're like, oh, but it reminds me of like nuclear bombs, and it's like it's emission free and it's super super safe. It's up there with solar and wind. It depends which data you look at, but it is either safer than or as safe as solar and wind as far as deaths per kilowatt hour produced. It's incredible. And we're kind of just leaving it on the table. So I think nuclear, I think innovation and letting the market lead, a lot of really great priorities as far as.
And by the way, those dang windmills. First of all, they chop people up. Sorry, but they do.
People?
Yes, when you've got to go work on those.
Oh yeah.
You climb up inside the stupid things. And what's hilarious is they actually.
No.
Yeah, Well, yeah. Falling kills you quick. I grew up in the most expensive place to whitetail deer hunt in the world, and
Okay.
the ways you die hunting, it's not getting accidentally shot. It's not
Tree stands.
securing yourself in your tree stand, or, and nobody thinks about this, it's not having a tourniquet and being sloppy with putting your broadhead on your arrow, because you have arteries in your fingers. If you cut one, and then you got a mile and a half walk. If you don't have a way to clamp that blood off, you're not going to make it.
I never even thought about that. I don't know
Yeah.
many bow hunters though, I guess.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of like everybody should have a tourniquet in their car, in their backpack, because it's just like such an easy way to like not die accidentally.
I
Yeah,
love not dying.
yeah. Well, when I was growing up, a friend of mine was skinning a deer, and his knife slipped, and he hit his femoral artery in his leg, and
Oof.
he got his belt around his leg, which isn't as good as a tourniquet, but it's something. And he got to the emergency room. They said he had 3 minutes left to live.
Whoa.
So he lived by 3 minutes. I mean, he lived, I don't know, 6 miles from me right now. So like that's a very real thing. Kids, go get yourself some tourniquets and just put them in every bag. They're like $12. Seriously. Whatever you got to do, skip buying a pizza, keep yourself alive. All right. The nuclear thing, I'm gonna rant about that for a second, because I don't think there should be tax credits for electric vehicles. Um, or at least, or if we're going to, we at least need to say we're giving tax credits because we believe that electric vehicles can run on nuclear. So at least we're being honest about it, because what happens right now is electric vehicles normally run on coal, essentially, because that's where the electricity is coming from. And so that drives me crazy. It's like, I get it. Teslas are really cool. Like, they're fun. People like them. I have no problem with you owning that or whatever other vehicle you want to own. But this idea that they're instantly saving the environment, it's like, well, not unless we convert the energy grid.
Yeah, I think we've also seen that kind of on a broader scale. Certainly agree on electric vehicles. Honestly, I think they're awesome, and I think that in the future they could have promise. I just don't think that the current state that they're at also is that reliable. Just even aside from where the energy is coming from, they're really cool, they're really fun, but like you're not going to solve long haul trucking with EVs. It's just not happening right now. And as much as people love to compare us to other countries, the US is just so freaking huge. We are staying car centric and we are staying long haul centric. Like most of our internal transport is just going to be trucking. That's not a problem. We can innovate on that, but you're not going to solve that part of emissions with electric vehicles. But your point about electrification is also very well taken, because we've seen a lot of pushes in mostly at the state level against natural gas and this idea that you shouldn't have natural gas hookups in your home. I think this kind of more hit like mainstream news with sort of the gas stove bans. But natural gas bans, kind of more broadly and in new builds, have been a huge policy priority of a lot of progressives. And I think it's meant to be well meaning, but I think this is a very good example of sort of progressive versus conservative environmental policies. Conservatives in general do not support kind of artificially cutting off options. You know, if alternative power sources were actually cheaper and better, which they should be if we innovate them enough, we shouldn't need to ban certain power sources to get you to use them. The energy grid would just be running on those things. And what's happening, certainly in my home state of New York, as we keep having this like really anti-natural gas legislation, is that sure, it's electrified, it's coming from the electric grid. And as you said, where is that coming from? It's coming from coal, it's coming from dirtier sources. It's not just magically coming from solar and wind. And it's certainly not coming from nuclear, because New York State is also rolling back our nuclear plants, one of which was powering 60% of New York City for like decades, and just no one thought about it. So everyone was cool with it because
Oh
they
my gosh.
forgot.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's one of those ones that
It's
just
tragic.
kills me. It just kills me because I don't understand the downside, other than the like, well, a bad thing happened in Ukraine and a bad thing happened in Japan. And it's like, well,
It's
yeah, but if
vibes.
you
It's
dive,
straight up vibes.
yeah, yeah.
I
Uh,
do think
if you could
even
translate that for
progressives.
non-Gen Zers, please.
I mean, I do think that like young progressives are getting much better about nuclear, which I love. I mean, when you see these anti-nuclear campaigns and you see like the people who are represented in the videos, they're all kind of like boomer hippies for the most part.
Yeah.
Whereas when you ask the majority of young people, and I really think that conservatives have a huge opportunity here because young people just have that on their pulse. They don't remember doing, atomic bomb drills because I don't know, we didn't. I mean, I went to elementary school shortly after 9/11. We were more worried about that sort of thing than, atomic war or anything like that.
Did you just say elementary school?
Elementary?
Oh, you had a weird flourish on it. You sounded Canadian or something. I'm like, I get Europe close to the border. Dang.
It's elementary because there's like an A. I think I'm spelling it right.
No, yeah, no. I just in the Midwest, you'd just say elementary. Like you almost sort of drop the middle E out.
How do you say the coloring items that Crayola makes?
Crayons.
It's one word. It's like crayon. Just
Okay.
CRAN.
Well, I'm sure the audience appreciates that we took that sidebar. um, uh,
Policy questions.
so do you think that do you think we're actually going to move back towards this, or what is the temperature of the country, like realistically?
Realistically, I actually think that we are going to see a lot more support for nuclear. And it's most of this happens on a state by state basis, right? California, for example, was trying to decommission all of their nuclear power plants and they stopped because they realized, oh shoot, that's a bad idea. I think we have France and Germany as kind of overseas examples. France, which is what, like 90% nuclear, they're exporting power at this point because there's too much winning. They don't know what to do with it. Like they just have too much power, which is just not a problem that anyone else has. Meanwhile, Germany got rid of all of its nuclear and they're obviously struggling, especially with, the crisis in Ukraine.
Because Germany was buying a lot of natural gas from Russia, right? Because they got rid of their nuclear.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Which is also frustrating. I mean, I think, when we stop with natural gas, we end up going to coal, but when we stop with nuclear, we end up going to natural gas. So we're kind of just speed running, going directly to the worst types of fossil fuels, especially when we have sort of these like pipeline disruptions and liquid natural gas, export pauses. It's not that people just go, oh, you know what? I decided that I will in fact rely on solar and wind. You don't. You just get your fossil fuels from elsewhere.
Well,
And
and
certainly
it wasn't California doing like a rolling blackout as well at one point during a heat wave where they're like, well, you can only have air conditioning for X amount of time. That'll change people's opinions on policy really quick because it's one thing to have a bumper sticker. It's another thing to be sitting in like 107-degree heat inside and just cooking.
Yeah. It's really tough. And I think that honestly, we forget how lucky we are in the States. A lot of countries, especially in the developing world, deal with rolling blackouts pretty consistently. I think we're just so spoiled because we're so used to just having this abundant power that we don't understand that that's not the case for a lot of countries. And it's not always going to be this perfect if we, keep messing around with the hand that feeds us.
Yeah. On the vehicle thing, like, we're saying like, oh, well, electric vehicles aren't the answer. I tend to go with so I've got two SUVs that have a combined 400,000 miles on them, right? And the one I just had to get a tire, the valve stem was leaking on the tire. It was it's like a lifted 2004 Toyota Sequoia. So it is an old school V8,
Yeah.
16 miles to the gallon. I mainly bought it so Pete Buttigieg could be proud of me.
I'm sure he is.
And the thing there is that what I don't get about that is like, oh, you burn up so much gas. Well, first of all, I'm 6.5 feet tall. I have a dog that's 6 feet on his hind legs, and then my wife and two kids. Like, we need a vehicle that fits all of us, right? First of all, for being able to go anywhere. And second of all, just driving, using your stuff longer seems like to me one of the two best things you can do as far as just environmentalism or conserving resources, like just not throwing tons of crap away or buying a bunch of needless crap. And so, this whole thing, if we're going to throw away a bunch of, gas powered vehicles to do EVs, it's like, well, how much mining, how much manufacturing, how much shipping is that going to take? And then does it become worth it?
Well, and we see this with a lot of rebates, right? Because they'll do the electric vehicle rebates, but I've even seen them for, the gas stove, electric stove rebates, cleaner appliances. I've seen them for leaf blowers. We've seen at least in DC, there was a huge city council thing against leaf blowers, and part of it was supposedly for noise ordinance, which is hilarious in DC because that's not where most of our noise is coming from. But it's funny because if you're offering a rebate for these things, one, it means that they're not actually competitive products. Because if I'm in the market for a new leaf blower, I should just want the best leaf blower. And that should ideally be the electric one. But if it's not, then why are you making me buy an inferior leaf blower? And
So they were
two,
giving a rebate to not get a gas powered leaf blower.
yeah, it was rebates to like turn in your gas powered leaf blowers in favor, like to get electric ones, which is again wild because you're asking people to replace things, and that's ultimately what a lot of these rebates incentivize, is you're asking people to replace things before they should be thrown out. So whether that's cars, whether that's appliances, and I'm sorry if you're throwing out entire cars, or you're, honestly, realistically, you're not throwing them out, somebody else is buying it used, so it's still kind of in the ecosystem. um, that is much more wasteful. Certainly the argument can be made, and I've heard this from a lot of people, of like, okay, well, you're saving the emissions, or you're saving that fossil fuel usage in the meantime. But I'm sorry, I haven't crunched the numbers. I'm sure some think tank person could do this, but I just do not buy the fact that if I use my stove for 5 more years just because it's currently running on gas, that is actually worse than me throwing that into a landfill right now and getting a new stove. That just, the math isn't mathing.
Yeah. I had something on that on Substack. By the way, if you're listening because you know Alina, Seth Towerherd.substack.com, would be happy to have you over there. Billie Eilish, the
Yeah.
basically made in a jar pop star. Like I recorded this music in my bedroom, and yeah, your parents are super connected to the entertainment industry. Like you got built in a factory basically to be a teen pop star. She went on this whole rant about how artists are releasing like too many colors of vinyl records because it's bad for the environment because they're plastic. And so I looked at her own stupid web store, and she's got like probably 12 to 14 variants of her album on different colors of vinyl, which I'm a big vinyl person, like fine. But if you're going to ask me to give up vinyl, it's like, so I can't have vinyl records, but still like, the greenest quote unquote like stores are still, packaging everything in plastic bags when you leave. I'm like, I'm not going to stop buying records when all of our goods go into plastic bags. And if they don't go into plastic bags, every single dang piece of food we eat comes in plastic. Like that should be something we should be able to change.
I'll be honest, I didn't know that vinyl records came in multiple colors, so this is actually kind of exciting. I'm not a record person, but that's interesting. Yeah, no, Billie Eilish actually was really cool because she came out, I believe, and said that she was still going to have kids despite a lot of the kind of anti-natalism coming out of the climate movement. So she gets points on that front. I'll be honest, I also think she's a good musician, but I think that's a very good example of like this kind of internalized idea of, the greenwashing and the carbon footprint. um, One of the sort of lefty things that I will 100% buy into is that the idea of a carbon footprint, as propagated by a lot of these big companies, was kind of meant to shift the blame. I don't think that that means that we should completely disregard all of our personal decisions, but this idea that we're supposed to get everybody's buy-in and like genuinely lower their quality of life. And I'm sure people can laugh at that because like, colors of records are not a huge life difference, but low key they are. And I mean, death by a thousand cuts, your average person is willing to make equal swaps to help the environment. They're not actively going to make their lives worse to help the environment. And while I'm here to innovate new types of records so that it's fine having different colors, I have no idea how that works. I think it's a good example of like, I don't know, I've been told, okay, bring your own silverware when you go to take out places so that you don't have to waste the plastic fork. I'm like, I'm sorry, no one's doing that. There's a couple people that
Yeah.
are doing that, and it's a little gross when they pull out like a sort of wiped off fork from their purse. And they'll kind of do a little bit performatively if you're out at Chipotle with them. And kind of, I love that if it's what somebody feels super convicted to do, but those are, like you said, those are not the main decisions that are going to be actually driving environmental change. I think innovation really is in getting just cleaner options for things that we already use that people don't notice. Because when I think about somebody like my parents who, yeah, they love the environment, but they're not going to, you know, ruin their day or like
Yeah,
even
yeah.
just be packing their own silverware. Like I think my dad would find that hilarious unless you're going camping or something. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, and by the way, I don't hate Billie Eilish, and there's a couple of her songs I like. I wouldn't like. I'm an elder millennial, so kind of contextually, she's kind of way outside my like, kind of life
Get
experiences
off
right
of
now.
for sure. Yeah.
No, and I just think it's funny that she lies about her origin story so much.
Yes.
And I'm
Especially
because
since her brother is also in the same boat. But I don't know. She's under a lot of pressure. Like this whole like anti nepo baby thing is the weirdest like purity test that we put a lot of people under. Everyone goes
it.
into the same field as their
I
parents,
know. Well, I mean,
regardless of whether you're a musician or an actor. I mean, I think I retweeted something the other day. It was like if your father is a boilermaker, you are like 250% more likely to also become a boilermaker.
yeah.
I mean, it's hilarious if we start calling that a nepo baby, but
Well, yeah. I mean,
it
like
should
my
be
family
more comfortable
farms.
for people like that to admit it. Like it's
Yeah.
fine, just chill.
No, my family farms, and it's like nobody's really mad that like my cousin, you know, came
It's a
into the
nepo
family
baby.
business and didn't buy a John Deere from scratch. They're like, oh well, your land dates back to the 1800s. Why couldn't you buy your own? Nobody does that. So it's I guess I kind of understand why she lies about it. I'm glad that she wants to have kids. What is your take on this? Like this whole thing of like, oh, we're gonna have 0 children or we're going to have 1 kid. And I've seen a lot of millennials do that. Like a lot of my peers are like, we just want 1 kid. And I'm like, well, that's like the hardest way to do it because they got nobody to play with, and then you got to pay attention to them all the time. They get a little bit older and they just sort of run around in a pack. Like it's just easier to have more
Yeah.
than 1 kid. But they're like, well, the world. And I'm like, well, why do we got to wipe out people? Why can't we just pick like something we don't like and just, I don't know, wipe out some other species if the
Yeah.
world
No.
needs it?
I was laughing. My boyfriend and I were watching Sound of Freedom last night, and it's odd because not odd, but like the main character has 6 or 7 kids or something, which I later learned is actually what the story it's based on. That's how many kids he had. But I remember looking at the movie and going, wow, he has a lot of kids. But it's weird. We kind of become, desensitized to really small families because that's just what people are getting used to. My mom is one of 5 kids. My dad is one of 5 kids. I'm pretty sure if I had 5 kids, a lot of my peers would be like, oh my goodness, that's so many children. Ultimately, though, I think it's just like really, really tragic. The left likes to talk a lot about mis and disinformation and just not having the facts straight. But one of the biggest pieces of misinformation is that we should have fewer kids to save the environment. That's simply not true. It's been disproven over and over and over. Society just simply gets more efficient as we go. I think we like to talk a lot about, for example, energy sources and whatnot, but efficiency is a lot of what's driving our, decreasing per capita emissions, and they are going down. Like things are getting better, which is very easy to forget if you spend too much time on certain parts of social media or, God forbid, just listening to celebrities. But I think it's partly sort of a virtue signal to other people your age. I've certainly noticed this among my like older millennial friends, of going, well, gosh, I would have more kids, but the environment. And I only partly buy that that's even why they're not having kids. Like you said, a lot of people are afraid of it being difficult if you have more kids. So I think there's kind
I
of
think
just
there's a lot of financial stuff going on right now before I'm too hard on my own
yeah,
generation.
yeah,
Because if you ever heard the Simpsons example on this,
no,
no. Okay, so the Simpsons came out when I was I was probably 5 or something. I was born in 82. And so the show realistically was a guy who worked a union job at a power plant and could support a family of 5 with 2 cars and a mortgage on
yeah,
1 salary. And it's like now everybody has a part-time job even outside of like their white collar professional job because of some combination of student loans and housing costs and rampant inflation. And so I think that unfortunately, like, I wonder how many people say it's the environment, and really they're just they don't
yeah,
they don't want people to
They
know that
mean
there's
financial environment, like
yeah.
economic environment.
Yeah, and maybe it is a little bit of both, or sometimes we have to
Yeah.
convince ourselves that our decision is for another reason, you know?
Yeah, which I definitely could see happening. The point about not being able to support a family on one income is very well taken. Honestly, I think if conservatives ran more on that rather than every time you see this TikTok of some girl complaining about how difficult it is to make ends meet, and every conservative talking head is just dunking on her. I wish that we could be a little bit more compassionate towards folks like that, because they're symptoms of this broader movement of the fact that both of my grandpas were able to support 5 child families on one income. Um, and there's no way that we could do that with the average male income in the US. But at the same time, I will not say that this is the main reason that the math doesn't work out. But I do think it contributes to it. I think we've kind of had this sort of space race of ever raised standards for what raising a child has to look like. Like,
Yeah.
oh, you're not a good parent if you put food on the table and you clothe the child and you teach them to read and write and use the toilet. You now have to, okay, are they trilingual? Are they in swim lessons? And how are their croquet skills? Like, we have kind of this ever heightening ideal for what parenthood looks like. And not only is it intimidating, but it's freaking expensive. I mean, if you need every child to be in all of these different, sports and travel leagues, and they all need to go to private school, and oh, they need to have super aesthetic, like sad beige millennial outfits, of course it's going to get expensive. Your great grandparents thought they were succeeding a ton if you had all 4 of your limbs by the time you grew out of childhood and you didn't have cholera. Like, they
Yeah.
patted themselves on the back and they were like, great, Seth mostly speaks good English and we're so proud. I did my job as a parent. And there's a lot of, I don't even want to say like mom shaming, but kind of this, expansive view of what parenting a child looks like. And it's, the parenthood industrial complex. It's expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's not just expensive in money, it's expensive in time because
Yeah.
the number of people I've seen that they're like, oh, well, we're going to drive from St. Louis to Nashville this weekend for one lacrosse game for our 5th grader, and then we're going to drive home. I'm like, that sucks.
Yeah.
That just sounds like a terrible existence. Like, I'm so tired. All I did was drive to Holiday Inn and watch this one game or 2 games, and then we ate at Applebee's, and we came home and we collapsed, did some laundry, and had to get up at 5:30 the next morning for my corporate job. I'm like, well, you don't
Of course
have
you're
to.
tired.
It's like, well, junior might get a scholarship. It's like, you know what? I know a guy that led University of Southern California to a national championship in swimming, and then got recruited to go to the Olympics. And he was like, no, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm making tons of money as a banker. Like, I don't want the restrictive diet and the 4 a.m. practice. Sorry, bye.
Yeah.
And even he didn't get a full scholarship. So if you're not in the sports on TV, sorry, but like, your kid is not going to pay for college, even in D1, even if they're the best, unless it's basketball or football. Like, bottom line, it just, and so if you think that you're investing $40,000 into their childhood because they're going to get free school or whatever, you would be better just putting them in Little League and investing that money, because it's not going to
because
return.
that would actually pay for the most of the college. I mean, I'm sure college prices keep going up the more that we have federal loans available for them. But no, 100%.
Yeah.
Not to mention, there's a lot of academic scholarships that are much more available if you have time to, develop a kid's personality and whatnot.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think I think that's another good example of people saying, well, it's to pay for college, but ultimately it's kind of because a lot of parents want to live vicariously through their kids, or they feel like that makes them a good parent if they do it. I didn't play state championship football, so my son is. It's like, okay, you guys gonna have a good relationship, or is he not even gonna talk to you by the time he gets there anyway? But I don't know. I mean, I played sports growing up. I played sports in college. I think they're awesome. My dad was very big on, he's like, listen, ladies, like, there's a lot of female scholarships available after Title IX. Unfortunately for him, I'm just not that athletic. So, it just.
Well, you just said you're not athletic, and also you made it to college athletics. So what was the sport? And
I did D3. So in college, I played rugby, or in high school, I played rugby. Got a bunch of concussions. That was not an option for college. Otherwise, honestly,
I
probably
would
could
have
have pulled
not
off.
guessed that. Just from like
Yeah,
the crappy East Coast sweater you
sports.
have on right now. I just would not have. I would not have made that call.
I was honestly surprised when I first joined rugby. I think I was picturing like the very stereotypical like buff girl, and we did have those. We also had a ton of cheerleaders, um, mostly because you have to like you know throw people up for what's called a line out, so the ball goes out, you know,
Yep.
pop it back in, and you have to basically boost the girl like you were doing a cheerleading lift. And so we would get a lot of off season cheerleaders, and man, it was very like Regina George and Mean Girls, where she has to let out the anger. It's like, oh wow, like you ladies just don't have the opportunity to tackle someone else, and this is a wonderful outlet for you.
So you don't play. You had too many concussions, so you don't play as an adult or anything like that. Then.
No, I still play tennis. I'll kind of just like do pick up tennis and whatnot. And then I did, I think, 1 or 2 seasons of track in college, but that was because I went to a small college and they would kind of just like go around to all the other sports and be like, hey, who wants to run one event? I threw javelin, which is a stretch, but there were just like no women to do it the year that I was getting quote unquote recruited. So I just feel like, you seem bendy. Do you want to throw this? If you throw it into the ground, we get more points than if you don't. I'm like, okay. So, but I don't know. I mean, I would say that I'm, probably more athletic than the average human being, but certainly not as far as like competing for crazy D1 scholarships for things. But I don't know. I got a full ride for academics because I was able to actually spend that time in childhood and in high school. Especially when you don't have friends, you just study a lot. But no, I'm kidding. But um, I don't know. I think sports are awesome. The number of people that I knew who were kind of forced to do it and like the rationale for being forced to do it was you might get a scholarship someday. Very few of them enjoy playing now. And very few of them end up like, doing more pickup and whatnot. Whereas I think if you were kind of taught as like, this is part of your personality, my mom was especially really big on have some hobbies that you can do forever. She was kind of anti-rugby for that point, which is funny because I know some like 50 and 60-year-old women who still play rugby. But I don't know, like she made us all do instruments. I think instruments, tennis, anything that you can just kind of have actually as a personality trait rather than feeling like it's a side gig. Um, I think it's just like looking at a sport a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really cool. You got that well rounded, and that's one of the things. Like when you look at sports culture, that my 5-year-old, my oldest, she can start a fire with flint and steel.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, okay, she has assistants, right? But we save all of our dryer lint to be able to start fires, and she can strike the flint and steel and get the dryer lint going, and then blow on it and put leaves on it and stuff like that. And I bet, what do you think? 90% of adults in the United States can't do that.
100%.
Yeah, and
Easily.
yeah, that stuff has to go somewhere. And if you're one of these suburban families that your schedule is just packed all the time, like there's no places to go do that. And one of the things that I kind of wish more people knew about this is like anxiety and depression goes down a lot. Like when, quite frankly, you put yourself in like uncomfortable situations that require like a lot of effort, because it just puts everything else like the heck back in, into focus. Because otherwise you're like, well, my professor or my teacher or my boss might be mean to me. And it's like, well, when you've been on a trail all weekend, or when you drug a deer 6 miles out, with your hands covered in blood, and then you eat it, preferably after you process and cook it. But you know like you're just not as worried about stuff. And
Yeah.
we've robbed people of that, because you used to have to do that stuff. You used to have to cut, like, I mean, I grew up partially in a home heated by firewood. Like you used to have to go cut firewood. And you can't do as much navel gazing and as much social media and as much just generally being sad and not sure why, when like you've actually got to go do stuff. And now life is really easy, so you have to plan the pain.
Yeah. It's really easy, but we haven't necessarily removed the anxiety from it. I just finished that new Jonathan Haidt book on the anxious generation. Highly recommend,
Yeah.
especially as someone with kids. Uh, But I think one of the cool parts about starting a fire or splitting wood is just that it there's that follow through and there's the resolution. You have the anxious spike, but you also learn that you have agency and self efficacy to solve your way out of those situations. You don't get that when you're constantly just having this like anxious mode activated, and you just end up in sort of a defensive mode rather than actually being exploratory because your brain is learning that there's no good at the end of the process,
Yeah.
which I think doesn't really help anyone. My mom, when she was teaching us how to swamp a canoe when we were younger, she took us out into. My mom was like a crazy good swimmer. She went to Olympic trials for like diving and swimming, and she's just a beast. She took us in a canoe out towards the middle of the lake, stood up, and she started telling us some story about like, oh, and then there were too many coconuts in the canoe, and she just put her foot on the side of it and flipped it. And then, all right, ladies, if you can get it back, you're allowed to take this canoe out by yourselves anytime you want. She made me swim it back. Um, and she was there, but she was kind of always, she swam back to shore without us. And she was watching from the shore and just, if we went under, she would come get us. But we were strong swimmers. And um, I was pretty annoyed with her. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I think I was like 8 or 9. I was like, oh, what the heck, mom? Like, I know how to swim. Why would you do this to me? But after that, I mean, gosh, especially as an 8-year-old, I was bragging to everybody I knew. I was like, I've swam a canoe a half mile. I'm pretty cool. And I think it taught me that okay, stress isn't a bad thing. It's time not to lay down and freak out and just like go into defensive mode. It's time to go, okay, how do I solve this? What's next? What do I do next? And it makes those moments of stress, good stress rather than something that just kind of cripples you.
Yeah. And it's really hard to find those when you said like fitness has all become like indoor climbing and it's
Yeah.
become, everything is like air conditioned and there's Gatorade available and whatever it is. Like if you never really find that pain point, that point of discomfort where it's like this is really hard, I don't know how I'm going to do it. I'm actually scared. That you're really missing something and you're making your own life by making it easy, you're making it much more difficult. You're making it much more anxiety ridden. So much that is just solved by just getting into some sort of unplanned situation. It's like, just go do the dang thing, you know? And I don't know how we scale that up. When we talk about environment, like kind of environmentalism, conservation. How do we get people to just have the backbone to do when we talked about the origins of the United States? Like the British wouldn't go into the woods, right? Scots, Irish, Germans would go into the woods. And it's like, how do we get people at scale to just be like, you know what? Heck with it. I got a pack. I got a pack on my back. I got enough water. I got some shoes, 10, 20 miles, whatever it is. I'll get back somehow. Like I'll make it back in some way.
I think we approach the problem the same way that we would anything else being outdoors, right? I think that one of the sort of core progressive impulses is like, okay, we have to scale immediately. We need this to be federal level policy. Okay, how do we have some sort of like civilian conservation corps initiative, which is awesome, by the way. We need more of those. But like, how do we have some federal level initiative to just immediately force everyone to do this? And I think the very conservative impulse is to go, okay, well, I might not be able to personally scale this, but the way that these things do scale is through grassroots action. I mean, those Scots Irish people going and walking into the woods didn't have like a giant Facebook group. They didn't have a giant movement. They didn't know anyone, probably most of them outside of their state, their entire lifetimes. And I think that we forget that, especially in this age where we're used to being super connected, we're used to having a giant platform. Um, the biggest way that we do this is by influencing your family, influencing your friends, do work at your church. I think churches are a fantastic way to scale things. Not in a self-interested way, but just I will constantly email stuff out to our church listserv. Anybody who emails into it, we get the funniest requests. And I'll be like, hey, going hiking this weekend. Who wants to come? And I think that sometimes by having a little bit of humility about the amount of scale that we can typically have in an average day, week, or month, we end up having a lot more impact over time because we encourage others to do the same, rather than getting overwhelmed by the size and scale of the problem initially.
Yeah. Well, and that's the way most, I mean, like there was no national council on pickleball, and that is blown up like
Yeah, it's
crazy.
huge, and everybody's heard about it from like their neighbor. Um,
Yeah.
I saw
You played
pickleball
tennis.
paddles at Target the other day. I was like, what?
Yeah. Well, there's even like a decommissioned mall here in St. Louis that, that is now like essentially just pickleball courts, which is really cool.
I
I'm not
never
a
thought about that for a mall. That's honestly anything sports related would be great in old malls.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
well, our oldest was going to gymnastics at one point in a decommissioned mall that was all like youth sports stuff now, and then it
That's
actually,
great.
unfortunately, they all got like kicked off their leases, and now it's just warehousing space, which
Mm,
is just kind of a bummer.
yeah.
But yeah, that's a pretty good way to do that. So, really, like this is essentially, I guess, to kind of start to land the plane here. This is a decentralized conversation about like just either invite a friend or just go do it. Even if you don't see yourself as an outdoorsy person, you will be a heck of a lot less sad if you can just pick a thing, just go. Um, because like I know people like, well, I don't know how to kayak, I don't know how to canoe. You actually might want to go with somebody for that. Like anything you can
Yeah.
drown, you might want to go with a friend. But for the most part, for the rest of it, just go do the thing. Like, and if you've got young kids, start them now. Like start them now so that they grow up and like you don't hit junior high school where they just collapse into puddles because they don't know how to do anything. Like
And
let
because they
them
don't
be
have
uncomfortable.
hobbies offline. I mean, I think it's awesome that, you can use the internet to meet people to do podcasts with. Like, the internet is not a bad thing depending on how you use it. But I think when people's lives primarily exist online and, you talk to people online more than people offline, it really colors your perception and it kind of colors the way that you can see other people because they're probably primarily a lot more combative. They're more transactional relationships, things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think the bar can be pretty low. Like a lot of people's local parks, there's nothing dangerous there. Um, or if there is something dangerous, like it's appropriate levels of danger. I think this sort of safetyism in our culture of playgrounds getting safer and we don't let kids, you know, go play with a hammer and nails sometimes. Kind of like you, we had a wood burning stove in one of the houses that I lived in growing up. And so I got to learn how to split wood at a pretty young age, which I think, and I've had to kind of check myself because now I think about like, okay, would I give a 9-year-old an axe? And I'm like, whoa, my parents did, and everything was totally fine. Like I think it's even kind of seeped into our own brains, just how safe we need everything to be. We used to play on hay bales all the time. Like there was this big field of
Yeah,
hay
we
bales.
did that a
We
lot.
just you jump on them, you flip them over, and get in trouble for it. Usually, like the big brown ones. Um, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting in that Jonathan Haidt book was he was mentioning that as a specifically hay bales as a model for things that are helpful on kids' playgrounds, mostly because you need more than one person to help move it. Typically, I mean, maybe at your size you don't, but me at age 10 certainly needed some friends to like roll the giant thing. And so you have to actually cooperate with other people. And these things don't become just like a single person, endeavor. I noticed that on a lot of our long hikes. You can have a much better hike if one person is carrying the food and another person is carrying like a blanket or whatever to set out, and somebody else has all the headlamps. More people do make it better, and you have to cooperate because you don't want the guy with the food walking back down the mountain because you guys got in a fight. Like, I think it's good interpersonal problem solving more than just, oh geez, it's raining and I'm cold, which
Yeah,
is also good.
yeah. And by the way, that's as a parent, one of the things that I need to make sure I provide for my children is the opportunity to be cold, hungry, in small bits
Small
to see
bits.
you're not going to die, right? Like because we've been out before and it's just raining, and it's like, well, we're gonna have to get back to the car. That's where it's warm, so keep going, kid.
Yep.
Like, there. But I actually took both kids to a playground last night that opened in St. Louis. Just incredible, 35-acre playground. If you can imagine it, like
Awesome.
has everything. And what was funny is they've got all these, slides and tree houses, and they have a little kid zip line and all this stuff. And my oldest, she like at the end, she just wanted to walk in the creek. And so there was big rocks. And so they were a little bit slippery. And then, I was kind of holding the 1-year-old's hand and letting her kind of wade in the water. and it was getting a little bit chilly. So I'm like, well, we shouldn't be out here super long, but we were all soaked basically. And to see the other parents just look over at me like, why are you walking rocks? There's this astroturf area over here just for playing, and it's like, and that's why like we're introducing a little bit of risk to be able to like let them have some agency and authority.
Yeah.
I didn't suggest it. I was like, well, let's go play on the rocks. So, cool. And unfortunately that is just not an option in many childhoods. And then that turns into, in my opinion, probably bad environmental policy because it's like you're trying to have opinions on things you've never actually seen.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, we have to preserve the national parks. We have to preserve the state parks. Have you ever been in one? Have you ever been a half a mile away from your dang car? Ever?
I see this all the time with especially hunting and farming. You get the hottest takes from people who've never been to a farm in their lives, who never have had any exposure to hunting. My favorite is always like, oh my gosh, the deer populations are going to die out. And you're like, why do you think we're hunting them? Do you think deer are
People
endangered?
think that? I guess I'm so Midwestern, I'd never heard that take before.
I've mostly heard it, I guess, from very, very urban folks on the East Coast, more grad school classmate type people.
Okay, I actually do support those people not having children for the sake of the environment.
It's just so sad, though. I mean,
well, you have to you get a whole bunch of bonus tags in the Midwest because the populations have exploded. What's that? Yeah, well, because people have to decide what they want. We can either have bears and wolves in the suburbs, and they will eat the deer, and they'll also eat kids, or we can deer hunt more. Like those are the options. Or we can wipe out everything and have empty forests, which is what they've done in like Honduras, and they have no wildlife. Yeah, that's not a great option either. And so that's just funny to me that and also, why is it wrong for me to shoot a deer with a rifle or a bow and eat it, and why is that okay for a bear to do the same thing? Like, why is a bear more ethical than I am in their eyes?
I didn't know that bears could use rifles. That's awesome. They must be like a lot more advanced where you are. I mean, although I loved that national parks tweet about somebody was complaining about why don't they just make the trash cans more difficult to get into in the national parks? And they said, well, there's significant overlap between the smartest bears and the dumbest tourists. So,
Alita, I don't actually know how to say your last name.
It's Cluff, like rough, tough, and enough.
There we go. You also, I'd love to do a part 2 with you because there's a whole set of other topics, but you got to be off in like 3 minutes, so we're not gonna get into them. If you want to just kind of share where people can find you, and then kind of find some of the kind of conservation links and stuff that we've talked about here, that would be, let's do that. And then if you're cool, let's do a part 2 on just kind of some of your writing stuff, because I think that there's pretty good content in there as well. So let's do that and do this again another time.
No, that'd be awesome. Can't wait to come back. I am mostly on Twitter at Cluffalo, Cluffalo. Also on Instagram at Elena to the left. My left leg is shorter than my right. That's not like a political statement or anything. But don't post a lot of political stuff on there or anything. It's just a personal Instagram, but happy to connect with anybody. So
wait a minute. You've got 90 seconds left. So explain that real quick. You played college sports. Your left leg is shorter than your right leg. So do you have to wear like a built up shoe?
So I'd actually tried wearing a lift for a little while and didn't really like it. I kept like twisting my ankle because it can be really hard to run with. The discrepancy has evened out a little bit. It was 2.5 inches for a little while. My feet are also off, so I can stand on one leg and be different heights. Which
this isn't because of the rugby, right?
No, it's in general. It just happened growing up, and for a little while I had like a little bit of a gimp in my walk. Now honestly your hips kind of just even it out, so I have to do a lot of like lifting in that way, but it's helpful when you're running on a track because you just naturally turn left.
Weird advantage. My name is Seth Hurd. You can find me over on Substack, or obviously in the places where you find the socials of podcasts. If you just kind of stumbled upon this, you watched a bit on YouTube, you can always get the audio only version if you want as well. And then Alina, you're also a journalist, and so we've got a whole nother probably episode that we can do on that. So let's call this like a part 2, and we'll we'll have you loop back around. Is that cool?
Awesome. Can't wait.